Types of government. Some of you may be well aware of all the kinds of government that I'm going to talk about, but it's really important that we understand that we're all on the same page in terms of government. In ancient Greece, as you know from the introduction, Greece was a very isolated place. So a city-state was basically a community, and it decided its own government structures, much like the other civilizations we've spoken of so far this year. So, what type of government does this image represent? So, if you can just take a finger and point which is an oligarchy, which is a monarchy, which is a democracy, and which is a tyranny. Some of these are a little bit subjective. I'm just going to give you a minute to think about this. And ladies, I'm sorry, but ancient Greece initially only recognized men having the ability to lead. So let's go on to the next sheet, and if you can identify which of these they are, and I'm going to talk about them in brief. All right, so a monarch is when you have, say, a king. Oligarchy is when a small group of people are in charge of government. A tyranny has sort of a negative connotation, but in ancient Greece, it was not always a negative thing, and it's where one person takes power, most likely in a military action, but they rule not as a monarch, but as an absolute person in charge. And then there's a democracy where there's a varied group who find themselves in charge. So, a democracy ruled by many, a monarch ruled by one, oligarchy ruled by a few, anarchy is when no one rules, and a dictatorship is ruled by one as well, so a dictatorship would be much like a tyranny. So let's move on here. So when we talk about ancient Greece, we are talking about first a monarchy, okay, and that then we move to oligarchy, where it was a few, and then a tyranny, where some people took power and said, we're going to do this, and finally a democracy. All right, so let's first go through the different types. Monarchy, from 2000 to 800 BC, Greek cities were often ruled by monarchies. The kings were first picked by the people, and if the king died, they picked another king. Over time, monarchs got to feel like they were sort of entitled, and instead of just picking a new king, they would allow their son typically to take over. Kings of ancient Greece made laws and acted as judges, conducted religious ceremonies, punished people, and used their military as the enforcer, led armies during war. There was also underneath them over time a council of aristocrats being what they considered at the time the best people, who were wealthy people who had inherited large pieces of land. At first, the aristocrats' council had little power and just was sort of a advisory council to the king, but over time they realized that they actually had more power, which got to be kind of a problem. An oligarchy. Oligarchies occurred in ancient Greece, 800 BCE. Most cities were ruled by these at some point. It's a small group of wealthy men. There was rule in a few small individuals, and they had inherited land. Sometimes they were merchants. They led very comfortable lives, hunting and watching chariot races, while at the same time the poor working class were working just to survive. Over time, the oligarchs seemed to be ignoring the needs of the people. They passed laws that benefited them and used the soldiers to enforce that system. So the rich became richer, and eventually the poor began to rebel. This is not a tyrone, it's a tyranny. Sorry about that. From the 600s, people turned to men who promised to change government. So usually it was a forced way from an oligarchy to a tyranny, but that did not mean necessarily they were unpopular men. They were often very popular and rose to power through military action. Most tyrants were successful. The last tyrant in Athens was not. Hippias was the last tyrant in charge, and people who did not like him murdered his brother. And as soon as they murdered his brother, he got really harsh and said, "You're going to do stuff like that, I'm going to be really strict." And he was later removed from power. Democracy. All leaders participate in a rule. 500 BCE. People of Athens to try government themselves. A direct democracy means that all citizens share in the ruling power. We do not have a direct democracy in the United States. We have what we call a representative democracy, meaning we elect officials that we believe are going to carry out what it is we want in our government. In terms of Athens, they did have a direct democracy. They had an assembly where there was a lawmaking group. Any free man could speak and vote, and free men also ran the day-to-day businesses. Sometimes the people didn't make the best decisions. They were influenced by very strong speakers, and they made incorrect decisions. Most city-states abandoned the system of government and went back to either dictatorships or oligarchies. So again, I want to go over these one more time. Monarchy is when you have one person who rules. An oligarchy is when you have several, usually aristocrats, rule. Tyranny is when one person comes to power and rules, usually by force. And then there's the democracy. Two types of democracy. Underneath that, there is direct democracy, which is what Athens had. And again, in the United States, what we have is representative democracy. So hold tight to those ideas. In the next video, we're going to talk about Athens and Greece, and you're going to decide where you would like to live.